transition from a industrial economy, the Rust Belt, into one that they don't know what they're doing. And New York City, a service economy with a high proportion of people who, many of whom, live off of the benefit of the state. Let's see who else. The District of Columbia, Connecticut, and New Jersey round out the top 5. So if the discussions about the fiscal cliff are to be believed, then this technique of limiting deductions as a way to close the loopholes and sticking it to the rich are going to hit the so-called rich in some pretty blue states. Those that have the least amount of itemized deductions would include the states of Kentucky, Alaska, Ohio, Iowa, and Indiana. And can I just say here for a moment, I have no idea what's going on in Iowa. I don't know if it's the genetically modified corn or something else, but that the state of Iowa went for President Obama in this re-election is so counter to what was in their best interest, their own self-interests. For the life of me, I cannot fathom. But alas, we digress. What will we do if businesses continue to make these decisions, operating again in their own self-interests, to protect their profits and wait for some sense of security? Well, the result will probably be a fallback into recession. And that'll help all of us, won't it? That should do wonders to help bring down the number of people on unemployment. This should do wonders to bring down the number of people who are drawing food stamps. This will do wonders to stimulate small business investment, to take risks, and create jobs. Again, more sarcasm. You're listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the CB Media Network. Hope that you're enjoying the run-along. I think you'll enjoy this next segment when we come back. I think we finally have a solution in that we finally know what the number needs to be to ensure that the rich pay their fair share, courtesy of that economic wizard, Paul Krugman. Stay tuned. We'll talk a bit about that when we come back. You're listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Stay tuned.
I always loved watching the kids play basketball. I still do, even though things have changed. It's funny, they can't find jobs to get their careers started. And I can't afford to retire. And now we're all living together again. I supported President Obama because he spoke so beautifully. He promised change, but things changed for the worse. Obama started spending like our credit cards have no limit. His healthcare law made health insurance even more expensive. We've had stimulus and bailouts. Obama added almost $16,000 in debt for every American. How will my kids pay that off when they can't even find jobs? Now Obama wants more spending and taxes. That won't fix things. I had so many hopes. Cutting taxes and debt and creating jobs. That's the change we need. Tell President Obama to cut the job-killing debt and support the New Majority Agenda at newmajorityagenda.org.
Is the economy getting you down? Are you looking for something to keep the kids busy while you wait in that long unemployment line? Wacko Toys, makers of the Alvin Green for Senator action figure and the Lindsey Graham boomerang, present their newest innovation. It's the Pete Stark Pet Rock.
All right, kids. Check out what's new from Wacko Toys.
Oh, come on, Dad.
Man, this thing is heavy.
That's right. Your Pete Stark Pet Rock comes weighted down with decades of backwards socialist ideas and is cryogenically thickened to the exact mass of your favorite Democratic demagogue's skull. You'll have loads of fun as you sit your Pete Stark Pet Rock in a quiet corner and wait for the next 38 years as it grows dustier and denser with every passing election cycle. Plus, if you act in the next 22 and a half seconds, we'll even throw in the Pete Stark Smartass Answer Pack. The next time some concerned and informed constituent asks you a pesky question about border security or just what the limits of the federal government are, just whip out your pre-marked and indexed Smartass answer cards to send back zingers like,
our borders are quite secure, thank you.
And
The federal government, yes, can and do most anything in this country.
yes, indeed. And as an added bonus, if your Smartass Answer Pack doesn't send those contentious questioners scurrying for cover, your Pete Stark Pet Rock is dense enough to be considered a deadly weapon throughout the European Union, North Korea, the People's Republic of China, and the state of California. So be the first person on your block to get the Pete Stark Pet Rock.
Come on, kids. Let's try it out.
So, what? It just sits there?
Mommy, Daddy forgot to take his medicine.
Warning, since there are no limits to how far a Pete Stark Pet Rock will go, please make sure you are not in a glass house when throwing one. Wacko Toys not responsible for any physical injury resulting from responses to the Smartass Answer Pack. Used only in public under careful supervision and protection by United States Secret Service agents.
I'm working.
And welcome back into the Palmetto Conservative Show. I'm your host, Jim Lee, here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Hope you're enjoying this little journey tonight as we work our way through the issues of the day. Love to say that things were just all hunky and dory, but then I would be spewing bovine fecal matter, and I don't want to find myself in the same class as our illustrious administration. So, we've long been asked the question, or at least I have been long asking the question, all right, for the sake of argument, let's agree that the rich, a heretofore undefined number, but the rich need to pay their fair share. And we keep asking, well, what is that? First of all, who's rich? And I think for the sake of argument, let's go with those earning $250,000 a year or more. And so if we can use that as a baseline for our argument, that we've defined the rich, well, how do we define what fair share is? Well, many have been afraid to answer that question, but thanks to Paul Krugman, we now finally have an answer to that question. Mr. Krugman opines in the New York Times on Monday that he thinks he has the answer. Mr. Krugman writes, the Twinkie, it turns out, was introduced way back in 1930, and he had to go ahead and bring that up. In our memories, however, the iconic snack will forever be identified with the 1950s, when Hostess popularized the brand by sponsoring the Howdy Doody Show. and the demise of Hostess has unleashed a wave of baby boomer nostalgia for a seemingly more innocent time. Needless to say, it wasn't really innocent. But the 50s, the Twinkie era, do offer lessons that remain relevant in the 21st century. As I read this with rapt interest. Teach me, Mr. Krugman, teach me. Above all, the success of the post-war American economy demonstrates that, contrary to today's conservative orthodoxy, you can have prosperity without demeaning workers and coddling the rich. Remember, demeaning workers and coddling the rich. Consider the question of tax rates on the wealthy. The modern American right, and much of the alleged center, is obsessed with the notion that low tax rates at the top are essential to growth. Remember that Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, charged with producing a plan to curb deficits, nonetheless somehow ended up listing quote-unquote lower tax rates as a quote guiding principle. So apparently Mr. Bowles and Mr. Simpson fall into that pejorative group known as the modern American right and much of the alleged center. But I digress. Mr. Krugman continues, yet in the 1950s, incomes in the top bracket faced a marginal tax rate of 91%, that's right, 91%, while taxes on corporate profits were twice as large relative to national income as in recent years. The best estimates suggest that circa 1960, the top 0.1% of Americans paid an effective federal tax rate of more than 70%, twice what they pay today. So here, Mr. Krugman is insinuating that apparently an effective federal tax rate of 70% comes close to representing what their fair share is. So if you think about this, God only asks or requires 10% as your fair share to give back to him for all he's given you. But in the liberal mind, the fair share is 70%. So God says you can keep the 90 of the 100% that I give you and only give back 10%. But when the government, you can keep 30 of the 100% that you earned because the government didn't give it to you, and we'll take 70%. That's fair. But again, I digress. Nor were high taxes the only burden wealthy businessmen had to bear. They also faced a labor force with a degree of bargaining power hard to imagine today. In 1955, roughly a third of American workers were union members. In the biggest companies, management and labor bargained as equals, so much so that it was common to talk about corporations serving an array of quote-unquote stakeholders as opposed to merely serving stockholders. Oddly enough, I never heard that ever mentioned about corporations serving stakeholders. Stakeholder is a fairly recent politically correct term, often used as buzzwords and geek speak. But again, I digress. Mr. Krugman continues, squeezed between high taxes and empowered workers, executives were relatively impoverished by the standards of either earlier or later generations. In 1955, Fortune magazine published an essay, How Top Executives Live, which emphasized how modest their lifestyles had become compared with days of yore. The vast mansions, armies of servants, and huge yachts of the 1920s were no more. By 1955, the typical executive, Fortune claimed, lived in a smallish suburban house, relied on part-time help, and skippered his own relatively small boat. What Mr. Krugman seems to miss is that compared to the average worker, they were probably living in a smallish urban house, had no part-time help, and didn't worry about skippering anything other than their own